Genocide, that's a term which many of us have been using for a long time to describe Israel's onslaught against Gaza. I think many genocide scholars, such as the Israeli-American associate professor for Holocaust genocide studies, Shaiel, and Omar Bartov, the Brown University professor of Holocaust studies. Amnesty International, for example, releasing a report. We all know, of course, South Africa's case against the State of Israel in the International Court of Justice. Now, many have resisted that term. And I'm really fascinated to speak to our current guest. Very great to see joining us, who is Shaiel Ben-Ephraim, who is an Israeli-American academic who has gone on a journey, I think it's fair to say, and has now recently posted that he has come to the conclusion that Israel is committing genocide. Firstly, it's great to see you. How are you doing?
Doing great. How about you, Owen?
Not too bad, not too bad. I just want to ask you straight away, why did you decide now that Israel is committing genocide?
Well, I early on thought that Israel was not committing genocide, as like just about every other Israeli I know. And if you'd asked me as recently as a month ago, I would have been on the fence. But I think that the overwhelming evidence has been clear, and I've probably been denying it to myself for quite a few months now. The turning point, there's been several turning points for me. The major turning point for me was when I realized that the IDF was not fighting this war in order to defeat Hamas. And that took me many months to understand, because after the events of October 7th, I, as a committed Zionist and Israeli citizen, felt that Israel needed to act in Gaza. And I still believe that Israel needed to act militarily in Gaza. And Israel has acted militarily in Gaza many times before. And I wouldn't classify any of those operations as genocide. But very early in the war, or not, maybe 5 months into the war, it became very clear that Netanyahu wasn't doing what you needed to do in order to defeat Hamas, which would require, in many ways, more force than what was being used, just in a different way, taking over all of Gaza and creating an alternative government. That's what would be needed to defeat Hamas. Now, that doesn't need to be the goal of the operation, right? You could have a limited operation. Israel has had limited operations in Gaza before and then stopped. But the stated goal of the operation was to destroy Hamas. And massive amounts of force were being used in Gaza, but not in a way that could possibly, even theoretically, defeat Hamas, because Hamas is sitting there in its tunnels and it's controlling the major population centers. And when Israel goes into major population centers, it withdraws. And Hamas remains in control of the Gaza Strip. And it's not that this is because it's a bad strategy. It's a bad strategy. But there's also, the IDF is well aware, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is well aware, that you can't defeat Hamas this way. These are people who understand military. I understand military quite well. I have a PhD in military strategy, but they know even better than I do, okay? Once I started realizing that they're not doing that, I started thinking, okay, what are they doing? So the other thing that they were doing is trying to keep Netanyahu in power. The longer the war goes on, the longer he can stay in power. He's become very unpopular. He's even more unpopular now than he was 5-6 months ago. And he knows that as long as he's in power, he can use the powers of war and try to rally support patriotically, blah, blah, blah. So for a long time, I thought that was the main goal of the war. And that's certainly still part of the goal of the war. But some things have changed. There is, and always has been, a genocidally inclined element in the Israeli government, right? You have your Itamar Ben-Gvir, you have your Bezalel Smotrich, and you have people in the army as well who want to kill Palestinians, hoping that if they kill enough Palestinians, they'll go somewhere else or something like that. They've gained increasing power. They have veto power over Netanyahu. They can decide when they're removing him, when they're not removing him. And they can exploit the anger that the Israeli population has at the Palestinians to forward this approach. And then, of course, once Trump came up with that plan, the Trump plan to remove the Palestinians from Gaza, that gave them a motivation to increase the level of violence against the Palestinians in Gaza in order to encourage them to leave.
Okay.
So what we're seeing is an increasing amount of crimes against humanity committed by the IDF against the Palestinians in Gaza, less with absolutely no intention of defeating Hamas, and with an intention to make life in Gaza unbearable for the Palestinians. And I'm hearing this from people in the army. I'm hearing this from people in the Israeli Defense Ministry. You know, one of the things that changed my mind is that I started hearing people who I used to think of as sane and moderate people saying that this is what they want to do. And whistleblowers who early on were telling me the IDF is committing war crimes started telling me, listen, this is full-on genocide, what they're doing. So I just changed my mind based on the information on the ground. It gives me no pleasure at all to say that my friends and my family and my country is committing genocide. But there's no escaping it.
Just in terms of, I guess, your journey and just interrogating, I guess, maybe see if there's more of a journey you can go on. And I should say, by the way, I should have said very rudely, Shaiel is the presenter of History of the Land of Israel and Israel Explained. Do check those out. You mentioned previous Israeli onslaughts against Gaza, which you supported. Is that what you, I mean, that's what you suggested. I mean, human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch made clear that in every single one of those, Israel committed grave war crimes and crimes against humanity. So, for example, Operation Cast Iron Lead, which killed well over 1,000 Palestinians, and Amnesty International said that soldiers reported being allowed or even encouraged by the commanders to fire anything that moved, even if there was no danger to their lives. The reason I'm bringing that up is many of us would say this didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, I'm going to talk to you about Zionism, something which I know you say you're still committed to as a so-called liberal Zionist. But would you not accept that actually these weren't genocidal onslaughts in the past, but they were onslaughts in which the Israeli state committed grave war crimes against Palestinian civilians, and this is taking that approach to its logical conclusion?
No, I don't agree with that. I'll tell you, when I look at previous Israeli campaigns in Gaza, I agree that war crimes were committed, but I also think that war crimes are committed in just about every campaign. I never bought the whole the IDF is the most moral army in the world and all that stuff. Never bought that. You know, I know the Israeli army intimately. I'm talking about in the past when it was doing a lot better, you know, than it is now. I know the Israeli army intimately. I know its advantages and disadvantages, and it's not particularly moral army. But also, going back, its standards of procedure were very standard. And I know the mechanism that it has in order to identify civilian infrastructure, in order to identify civilian targets and avoid them. And it doesn't always do the best job, but it has that capacity, and it has done those things badly sometimes in previous operations. Let me finish. This is an important point. Okay. What I'm seeing right now is that they're using that capacity of identifying civilian infrastructure to destroy the civilian infrastructure.
Okay.
So you have like salination plants in Gaza that Israel is targeting intentionally. And in the past, it would look at those salination plants and say, let's not bomb those salination plants. It would not take enough care with family members next to terrorists, you know? It would not take enough care with bystanders next to terrorists. Those are all very bad things. It wouldn't allow in enough aid sometimes when it was blockading, all those things. The difference is, Owen, that now it's doing it intentionally. And that's why it's genocide and not war crimes based on targeting, lack of proportionality, all that stuff. I don't know everything that happened in previous campaigns, but I have seen no evidence that there was genocide or anything like that. But you're right. War crimes happen in every war, and the IDF commits them.
I think there's a lot of people would regard that as quite a dangerous attitude, that the normalization of war crimes, that it's just part and parcel of war. Because even
I agree that it's a dangerous attitude.
It's just quickly, 2014
illness, or at least it didn't used to be.
Well, I suppose many would argue that, again, these are war crimes which have been taken to their logical conclusion. That's why I'm just trying to tease that out. I mean, in 2014, 635 women, for example, and children were wounded, for example, in that. This was Israeli attacks I'm talking about the Human Rights Watch. Since July 7th, 2014, Israel officially said delivered more than 500 tons of explosive missiles, aerial bombs with artillery fire, killed at least 170 people and wounded 1,361 people as of the July 14th. So that was just the first week. And they said that...
2014?
2014, and found that attacks had destroyed 1,255 homes. Human Rights Watch said Israel's rhetoric was all about precision attacks, but attacks with no military target and many civilian deaths can hardly be considered precise. So, I mean, when we talk about war crimes, do we agree that people should be prosecuted for war crimes or not? And that's, I guess, the question. Many would say Israel had impunity before this happened. It knew it had impunity, which is precisely why it could take these war crimes to their logical conclusion. That's why I'm talking about these war crimes in the past.
Yeah. So listen, I don't want to push back too much on what you're saying because I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I don't agree with everything. So I'll tease this out. 2014, other Israeli campaigns in Gaza, not just in Gaza, Lebanon, everywhere. War crimes were committed. I don't even want to say less than other countries because I don't think that's helpful or true. And as far as impunity is concerned, you're absolutely right. Israel has always lived behind a partial lie, at least. It's at least partial lie. Now it's a total lie. That it had an independent judiciary that would prosecute war criminals. It is so rare that the Israeli independent judiciary, which is independent in many other ways, did do that. So rare that basically you had impunity. If you didn't go personally and shoot a baby in the head with 10 witnesses, no one was going to prosecute you. And that's the truth. And now, even the limited independence that the judiciary had, which was really a fig leaf in terms of not its independence generally, but in terms of what it did with war criminals, IDF war criminals, even that fig leaf is gone. They don't even pretend anymore. Right? So there's absolute impunity. And that has led absolutely to what's happening now. And now, if you tried to prosecute IDF soldiers, you would have so much backlash. And there's cases that were landmarks in this. You probably know Elior Azaria, the case of Azaria. He killed a terrorist and was filmed killing the terrorist, an absolute war crime. And he was turned into a hero by the Israeli right, but not just by the right. Average Israelis thought he didn't do anything wrong. He just killed a terrorist. And that's a case where, it's a terrorist. No one in Israel really cares. But it creates this precedent, and then you had what happened in Sdet Eiman. And in Sdet Eiman, you had people invade the base. And that builds on what happened with Elior Azaria. So I actually totally agree with you. There's a real problem here. And Israel talks about, the ICC and the ICJ, they're anti-Semitic and they're out to get us and all that. It's not true. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not true. I know people who work for both organizations, especially the ICJ. Mm-hmm. They're not anti-Semitic at all. Some of them are Jews. And they're trying to take over where the Israeli courts are doing nothing. And there's some partial efforts every now and then to prosecute someone. It's only when there's massive international attention that they admitted killing those paramedics. So I agree. There's a link, but it's gotten progressively worse.
We agree. In terms of the journey you've gone on, I'm interested. I'm just going to quote what Israeli leaders and officials were saying at the beginning. The 9th of October 2023, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that Israel was imposing a complete siege in Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. On the same day, Major General Ghassan Alian, the Israeli army general who's in charge of Kogat, which is a civilian arm of the Israeli army, for those who don't know, he said Hamas became ISIS and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade on Gaza, no electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell, you will get hell. Would you accept those are genocidal statements?
Absolutely. But at the time, you didn't have all these actions to match it with. And at the time, I also felt that this was, anger that would pass. And to some extent, that is anger that passed. So this argument might be a little bit complicated, but this is what I see, because I talk a lot to the people who are doing this.
Okay.
So this is what I see. I remember the day that it happened, October 7th. I talked to some of my friends, and I have, I'm a relatively left-wing guy by Israeli standards, now very left-wing, saying there's genocide is very left-wing. But at the time I was considered much more moderate, but still left-wing. A lot of my friends were a lot more left-wing than me. I talked to them that day, and a lot of them were telling me we need to kill every single person in Gaza. Every single person these are people who were saying we need to dismantle the state of Israel and create a one nation state, right? Now they're telling me let's go into Gaza and kill everyone. That's what these people were telling me. I knew things were going to get very bad. I knew the anger was outraged. I felt the anger too. I wasn't in Israel, so probably a little bit less, but I felt the anger too. Not going to lie. I wrote things back then, not quite genocidal, but also very angry. And I thought to myself, we're going to do horrific damage to Gaza. I had no doubt that what was going to happen in Gaza would be terrible and there'd be war crimes involved. I didn't think for a second there'd be genocide involved. And the reason is because I thought the anger would pass, not in terms of Israel wouldn't be angry at Gazans and Hamas, but in terms of slaughtering every single Gazan isn't something that they're going to be thinking in 2-3 months. To some extent, I was correct. People start talking more about removing Hamas.
Let me just scrutinize that a little bit. So Air Wars, which is an NGO, which investigates civilian harm from aerial bombardment.
Yeah, I know.
They established that in October 2023, so between the 7th of October and the 31st of October, at least 5,139 civilians were killed. Of those, 1,900 children. They said it is by far the most intense, destructive, and fatal conflict for civilians that Air Wars has ever documented based on that first month. They also said they looked at 606 incidents of civilian harm in that 25-day period, and they found that in which 5,139 civilians were killed, they found that the number of militants killed was between 30 and 58. Benjamin Netanyahu was also quoted in Ynet, the Israeli media outlet, and he was presented by the Israeli Army Chief of Staff with a list of 1,500 targets. Netanyahu reportedly erupted in anger, yelling and banging on the table. Why not 5,000? We don't have 5,000 approved targets, the Chief of Staff replied. And Netanyahu said, I'm not interested in targets. Take down houses, bomb with everything you have. Isn't it the case, actually, that the rhetoric and the actions were married, and it actually was genocidal from day one based on the rhetoric and the actions?
Yeah, so the quote you brought from Netanyahu, can I ask when you first were aware of that quote? Because I'm asking out of curiosity, not to make a point.
It was revealed last month.
Right. So I heard it the first time, 2-3 weeks ago, so maybe a little bit after it was revealed. I had no idea at the time that Netanyahu was saying things like that. In retrospect, it's very clear that the at least beginning of the mechanism of genocide was set at that time. The tone he used at that meeting, and I'm not saying that was the first time, I'm not saying that was a landmark thing because I don't know the other quotes, right? But the fact that he said something like that and the impact it has when a prime minister yells that at the chief of staff is massive, right? I didn't know that. Very few people knew that, right? So
no, we knew what they were saying in public, which was a whole litany of genocidal statements.
Look, Owen, at the end of the day, you were calling this a genocide early, and I wasn't. And you were right, and I was wrong.
But why? I mean, this isn't me prosecuting you. This is me interested because you're very important in terms of your journey. Because the vast majority of Israeli citizens at the moment, I interview lots of very courageous Israeli commentators and indeed genocide specialists who concluded it's genocide a long time ago. Courageous because it's exceptional. And, that's not, unfortunately, unique to Israel in terms of states which descend into this sort of genocidal mania. It is what it is. I suppose what I'm interested in is the journey. What I'm talking to you about is because we need to understand those who are currently very passionately pushing back at the idea it's genocide, because you've gone from that to this point. And that is important because if we could understand how that process happens, then we'd be in a pretty good position to stop.
Yeah, well, so I've always had a sympathy or empathy for Palestinian life that goes beyond a lot of my fellow countrymen. That's just a fact. So from the beginning of the war, I've been very concerned about Palestinian lives and concerned about Israeli violations of international law. I also taught international law, so I'm very aware of what Israel is breaking and what it's not breaking at any given time. So it's always been a little bit easier to convince me. The problem is that a lot of Israelis don't care about international law. They build, but not most Israelis aren't. Most Israelis don't want all Palestinians to die. Most Israelis don't want Israel to be guilty of genocide. Let's take the average median Israeli, because there's all kinds, right?
Yeah. Okay.
The average median Israeli doesn't want there to be genocide, doesn't want to kill all Palestinians. What the average median Israeli says is this, and this is not going to be something that you're not aware of. Hamas started this. The Palestinians support Hamas. If they want this to end, just release the hostages and surrender. International law doesn't really matter because these people don't follow it. And war is brutal. This is the Middle East. What are you going to do? That's the Israeli defense mechanism. It's very hard to get through that because you show them all this stuff. First thing they react is it's a lie. It's anti-Semitic media. Once you convince them, it's not that hard to convince them because you can show them this evidence, that evidence. Once you convince them, they tell you, okay, but what are you going to do? You have to make Hamas surrender, and they brought this on themselves. I don't know if my specific journey is really that helpful. I never really had that.
Okay, well, actually, I'll give you an example, actually, and we'll come on to
really had that mechanism that they do. I never thought the Palestinian people brought it on themselves. I always thought that
come on to that.
People are separate.
These are important points. Well, actually, the reason I'll give you an example because I'm going to quote what you said at the time. And again, this isn't aggressive. This is because
no. Do it.
So you said on the 19th of October, anyone describing a bombing campaign against terrorists, including a fair warning for civilians to evacuate as genocide, is spreading anti-Semitic libels. The point of labeling every Israeli military action as genocide is to water down the importance of the Holocaust. You said the genocide on the 3rd of December, the genocide libel is being used as an excuse to target Israelis and Jews everywhere. 15th of October, 2023. At the moment, we are waiting for civilians to leave before our invasion. Not much of a genocide. When my grandparents went through actual genocide, no one spared them. The point there, the reason I bring that up is those who have argued that Israel is committing war crimes, let alone genocide, have routinely been called and denounced as anti-Semitic. And anti-Semitism is a grave evil. It's a grave evil which and I don't need to lecture you as a Jewish person, I'm a goy, but obviously is responsible for, within living memory, the industrialized extermination of the Jewish people. That use of anti-Semitic blood libel is referring to the medieval anti-Semitic claim that ordinary Jewish people were murdering children as part of some sort of ritualistic sacrifice. And that term blood libel has been used over and over again when we're talking about a state, not ordinary people, we're talking about a state and its behavior. So I guess why did you really think that? Did you really think that people talking about genocide were trying to basically resuscitate medieval claims of Jewish people murdering children for religious ritualistic sacrifices? And do you see now that actually the very real evil of anti-Semitism, which has to be fought, there has been a weaponization to just shut down anyone who just doesn't like Israel committing really quite heinous crimes, which you've accepted now?
Yeah. So I did absolutely believe that a lot of people were using the genocide claims and the blood and as a blood libel. And I still believe that, honestly.
Why?
I think that early on, I'll tell you why. I think that early on in the war, Israel hadn't gone in yet. Israel hadn't been doing a lot of things that it would do later. It was reacting to the worst attack that had ever occurred to it. And people were already calling it genocide when there was no evidence of it at all. Some people were calling it a genocide on October 8th already. So we have a lot of protesters and a lot of bad faith actors who use what Israel, let me finish, who use what Israel does in order to delegitimize not only Israel, but also Jews all around the world. And some of them have millions of followers. And that's a real problem. And then meanwhile, the pro-Israeli system, the Hasbara system, has increasingly turned the word anti-Semitism into code for anyone who says that Israel's committing crimes in any way, while often minimizing the damage of real anti-Semitism, like saying Jews have killed Christ and Jews control the world and things like that. So what you have here, and this is something that I think everyone needs to face, is two echo chambers of horror. You have Islamophobic, justifying war crimes on one hand, and you have anti-Semitic hatred of Jews and support of terrorism on the other. And anyone who tries to go in between those two blobs gets hurt. And I've seen this even happen to you. I've seen you go after Hamas, right? And be called a liberal Zionist, which to a lot of people is a terrible slur, and be denounced for it, right? And that's happened to me. I've gotten death threats on the same thread from Zionists and from Hamas supporters. And my point is let me finish. My point is there's malign actors who are delegitimizing Israel and have been delegitimizing Israel from day one. And there's malign actors on the quote unquote pro-Israel side as well. And it's very difficult to pick out those who are well-meaning versus those who are not when you're being bombarded by people who are not well-meaning all the time.
I suppose my concern there is what you said there really brings into my mind in the McCarthyite era, there was a description of people who opposed fascism as premature anti-fascists, that they had come to that, and that meant they were communists. That was the point. That's what McCarthyism claimed. Raz Segal is an Israeli American, and he is an expert in Holocaust and genocide studies. He's an associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies. On the 16th of October, 2023, he said, Israel's assault on Gaza is a textbook case of intent to commit genocide. That's what he said. He's a scholar, he's an expert. When you say even now, and this is what I'm interested in, this journey you're hopefully still going on, people just listened to what Israeli leaders and officials said. And that proved to be the most accurate roadmap. It wasn't of what would happen. It wasn't venting. It wasn't, we'll get this out of our system. We're just really mad because of this terrible atrocities committed on the 7th of October. It is what they went on to do. They went on to make abundantly clear they did not see a demarcation between the civilian population and military targets. They saw the Palestinian people themselves as having a form of collective guilt, whatever you want to call it. But so you wouldn't call Raz Segal a promoter of blood libels, an Israeli-American associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies. He said this at the very beginning, within days of Israel's onslaught happening. He did have a point, didn't he?
No.
He was right.
I need to qualify what I said before. When I said I still believe it, I didn't mean to say that anyone who said that at the time was an anti-Semite and committing blood libel. What I meant to say is a lot of the people who were, that was their intention. I think there's a lot of people, not him necessarily, not you necessarily, who whatever Israel does, they look to label it in the worst possible way. And at the time, Israelis were very defensive over these attempts because the feeling was after these terrible crimes had been committed against us, we were being told that any form of retaliation was genocide. And that seemed very unconvincing at the time. And to most Israelis, still very unconvincing.
Of course,
because the actions that Israel had committed on the ground had not justified that label. I mean, I would be very hard pressed to say that Israel was committing genocide in October. You could say that it was indiscriminately bombing people. That's not genocide.
Well, I mean, I don't know what you mean, I suppose, by that, because in no genocide is everyone killed on day one. That's not what genocide means. There are genocides which have gone on for, we're talking generations. I mean, it's not an overnight. People think about the Holocaust, I think, and that distorts their understanding of genocide. That was obviously a genocide. It's also an outlier because it was an industrialized, systematic attempt to exterminate an entire people in a very short space of time. Every genocide has its own characteristic. Rwanda is another example. I mean, Rwanda, that genocide began because the Tutsi rebel army invaded in 1990, committed terrible war crimes, incidentally, and Hutu extremists said they're going to commit genocide against this, so we're going to kill them first. There's actually quite a lot of parallel. It's often the case that genocides happen in our conflicts. But the point I was making is I mean, October was the bloodiest aerial bombardment of the entire onslaught. And they were saying at the time that the civilian population were human animals. I mean, Israeli generals were saying that. And they were saying, we're going to give you only damage to civilians. He was talking to civilians there. I mean, the tweet was addressed to Hamas and the residents of Gaza.
Yeah.
So people were saying it's not to be offensive. I mean, they were just saying it because that's what Israeli leaders and officials were saying literally, and they could see Gaza being reduced to rubble, which it was.
There are people who did it for genuine concern, and there are people who did it to score points. And there are still people who make things up about what Israel does in order to score points and make Israel look as bad as possible. That's just a fact.
But now, you don't have to make them look terrible.
As far as there being genocide on the ground in October, November, December, I still don't think so. Because the reason I believe there's genocide now is because of a lot of things that Israel started doing later, like blowing up the entire hospital infrastructure. If you remember, at first, there were hospitals Israel was going into, and there was a lot of controversy around it, and Israel was saying, we're only going to this hospital for this reason and that reason, and so on and so forth. Later on, they started blowing up every single hospital in Gaza.
But they started bombing hospitals from the very beginning.
Right, but there's a systematic escalation.
It was just a continuum.
We're creating an argument here because you're creating an argument that's needless, in my opinion.
I don't think so.
Because I agree with you that everything that turned into the genocide started at the very beginning. But where I disagree with you is really that there's an escalation. And that the thing about a crime like genocide is that you need to have a lot of evidence that it happened, right? And over time, more and more and more evidence accumulated. So the level of evidence that we have, because time passed, because actions escalated, is now much higher than it was at the beginning. That's just a fact.
Well, I suppose we would say, those on the other side of this from the beginning would say the intent was very clear and it was stated. And intent matters. But I think, the argument, I think it's interesting in terms of, because I'm in terms of teasing this out, and you're talking about Israeli people, like people within Israel and the mentality they had afterwards, which was, well, Hamas brought this on themselves. But Hamas, that's what they said on 7th of October. They said, well, in 2023 alone, before 7th of October, 240 Palestinians were killed, 40 of them children. Thousands of Palestinians, including thousands of children, were killed between 2008 and 2023. So, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because, that's much bloodier. It's much more extreme violence, which Palestinians have actually suffered. But actually, that sense of, well, they started this war and they're only getting what they deserve. Well, that's starting the clock on 7th of October. I get it. But that's the same argument. It's just as a different dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons it took me a long time to realize how bad things were. Yeah. In 2007, Hamas take over Gaza. Israelis see Hamas as pure evil. I grew up in the 90s. 2 times buses blew up with people from my class, and we had to have ceremonies for the dead from Hamas when I was a kid. This happened repeatedly. I grew up in Jerusalem during the 90s. They were always blowing up our buses. They were always blowing up downtown. To us, we grew up with Hamas being pure evil. Then one day, they take over Gaza. So Gaza, for us, becomes a center of terrorism. And it has been. And it becomes very difficult for an Israeli who believes that Hamas is an evil organization, and it is. I have not changed my mind about Hamas in any way. To separate between what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. And also, there's the argument that Israelis have, which has less salience over time, that the people of Gaza voted for Hamas, brought them in, so, it's their problem. Like, what would you say to Nazi supporters who got bombed in Dresden and so on?
They said they
Israelis say. I'm not fully.
Yeah, of course. I know. It's because the Palestinians say, well, look who Israelis voted for. On just Israeli society, because this is what, again, I suppose I'm interested in this kind of, because I do think this is a case when genocidal mania meets impunity, which is a problem, because there's nothing to stop the mania, nothing to pull it in check. Because there's other examples you could say, Serb nationalism during the Balkan Wars, again, sense of the Serbs at the time, well, we were victims of not the Holocaust, we were victims of genocide in World War II, and we face an existential threat we either kill them or they kill us. That was the same mentality, and they suffered terrible war crimes against Bosnian Serb civilians. But I mean, if we look at the Israeli population, a poll last year showed that amongst Jewish Israelis, 1.5% thought too much firepower was being used in Gaza, and the rest were evenly divided between enough firepower and not enough firepower. And other polls showed consistently 60% thought all humanitarian aid should end, which it has now for the last 2 months. I mean, everyone knows what that means in practice. It means civilians will starve to death. When we say, well, it's not like they want to kill all Palestinians. I mean, when you've got half almost of Jewish Israelis thinking not enough firepower has been used in Gaza, what does that even mean? What does that even look like?
I think what you're missing here, not that I fully disagree with you, but what you're missing here is the goal. If you ask them, would you want that to continue once the hostages are released? You would get very different numbers. I don't know what the numbers would be. You would get very different numbers, because the reason for stopping humanitarian aid and bombing the bejesus out of Gaza for the median Israeli is to get them to release the hostages and surrender, not to get all people in Gaza killed. The difference between what you're saying and what I'm saying is that I'm saying Israelis don't care enough about Gazan civilians, and you're saying sort of they want them all dead. I don't think the median Israeli wants them all dead. I even don't think a lot of Ben-Gvir supporters want them all dead. What a lot of Israelis want, honestly, which is also not good, is for them to be pushed out.
Well, yeah, I mean,
want them to maybe stay, but release the hostages. And until they release the hostages, they don't care what happens to them. So that's where Israelis are. I talk to Israelis all the time. I very rarely hear anyone tell me we need to kill all the Palestinians. I do see that sometimes in WhatsApp channels, Telegram channels. Those people exist. I even know one or two, but that's not the average Israeli. They want to feel secure. They feel like they don't trust the Gazans at all. They feel like they're all Hamas supporters, or there's so few that aren't that it doesn't really matter. And that's what their policies are based on. Now, the trouble is, and this is where I had trouble, and you were correct that I was wrong, is that even if your intentions aren't purely genocidal, that doesn't mean the outcome isn't genocidal, right? You have these policies continuing, and some of the people who are enacting them want genocidal or semi-genocidal outcomes. So the outcomes are genocidal. It doesn't matter if everyone wants all the Arabs, Palestinians to die. I don't think Netanyahu wants all the people in Gaza.
Well, let me see what you think about this quote. I mean, how would you describe this quote? I mean, this is, I think, really interesting. So here's a quote. We'd all like to wake up one spring morning and find that 7 million Palestinians who live between the sea and the river have simply disappeared. Like, how would you describe that?
Who said that, by the way?
Well, I want to hear what you think about it before I tell you. It's not you, by the way. Just so everyone's clear, that isn't you. It's not some sort of trick.
No, of course not. That's horrific. That's you have this question here of whether that's genocidal or ethnic cleansing. I don't know if it really matters that much, but it's a horrific statement. Yeah.
That's Yair Golan. He's the leader of the last so-called Zionist left party in Israel, the Democrats. He's the moderate opposition.
I had no idea Yair Golan said that. Yeah.
But I suppose that's the issue, I suppose, is that I think isn't the problem, the inherent structural problem, that is actually a widespread view. It's just the division is how much the Israeli leaders start from that premise and work backwards based on what is politically possible at that given time. Because, for example, in 2016, a poll, this was by Pew Research, found that nearly half of Jewish Israelis believed that Palestinian citizens of Israel, not Gaza, not the West Bank, nearly half thought they should be expelled or transferred from Israel. I mean, that is a vast, we're talking about the 20% who are Palestinian citizens. That was years before 7th October. I mean, they're not Gaza either. I suppose that's the issue. Is it not just embedded in Israeli society this is, I suppose, why I'm interested in, it's a settler colonial mentality, which is we are superior, we're the settlers. We don't want these people, the indigenous people who are there on this land to exist anymore because they're a threat to what we want to build, which is a state which is for us, the superior people. And that's nothing, it's not specific to Israel. That's the history of settler colonialism for you. But I mean, that's that you end up thinking, well, we just rather these people weren't there, or they're an existential threat.
Yeah, I don't think that that's embedded into Israeli culture the way that you do. As someone who grew up in Israeli culture, I remember when they took my class, for example, to go to an Arab school. And this teacher said to us, listen, children, they're a little bit different from you, but they're people just like you, and you'll learn to play together, blah, 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 blah. And I remember our principal telling us, by the time you're 18, you won't have to go to the army because we'll have peace, and I remember going to peace rallies in the 90s. My point is not that Israelis are good. My point is this is based on circumstances. It's not about good. It's about a mentality that arises. It's not to do with being Israeli or anything. It's to do with the settler colonial mentality. No, I deeply disagree with that.
What about the polling? What's that?
I deeply disagree with the settler colonial mindset part. I think you're being over determinative here, and you have situations that arise over decades. You don't sit around your whole life being in a settler colonial mentality. You have periods where it feels like you can make peace, and you have periods where it feels like it's impossible. And I've lived through both. And when you have periods where you think that peace is impossible, people start getting more and more extreme opinions. And that's true for both sides. And that's something that's missing from your analysis.
How is it not?
Let me finish, Owen. Let me finish.
Okay.
What's missing from your analysis is the other side. The other side is just like us. They wanted peace in the 90s. Most of them wanted peace in the 90s. Then they started feeling like Israel's building all these settlements and doing all these horrible things to them, 100% correct. And they stopped believing in a two-state solution. They started believing more in terrorism. Israel stopped believing in a two-state solution, started believing more in occupation and building settlements and committing war crimes. And the difference between your analysis and mine isn't just academic. It's policy-oriented. Because if it's situational, if it's not based on being born in sin, based on being born in a settler colonial mindset, then you can fix it. But if it's based on original sin, you can't fix it. I don't believe in original sin.
I don't
believe in a settler colonial mindset that you can't change. I believe that circumstances can change. I believe that peace can be made.
Well, this is where we differ, because I suppose I would support a single state where everyone has equal rights.
Yeah, look, I don't really care what the structure is politically, morally speaking. Right.
That's important, though, because you're still a Zionist, aren't you? I suppose in that sense.
Let me finish. Yes, I am a Zionist. I'll tell you why. I do believe it's not practical to have a one-state solution for several reasons. First reason is Israelis will never agree to it. They will die to the last Israeli with the last gun before they agree to it.
That's what they said about white South Africans. It was exactly the same what people said about white South Africans.
Yeah, but the whites, if what a lot of people say, and this has to do with what I said, I don't have a moral objection necessarily to another structure. The trouble is, and this is an Israeli cliche, but it's true, the Palestinians don't have a Nelson Mandela. If there was a Nelson Mandela, maybe we could talk about that. Maybe if you could reassure the security concerns of Israelis with a sense of what we're doing is nonviolent.
Marwan Barghouti. Well, Nelson Mandela did it. That's not true. Nelson Mandela supported armed struggle. He was a supporter of armed struggle.
He managed to convince. He's a unique person. But there's Biko. There's a lot of other people. Whatever.
Yeah, but Marwan Barghouti is a Palestinian political.
I know Marwan Barghouti is.
Of course you do. Sorry, I'm just saying it for everybody else. And he is often compared to a Palestinian Nelson Mandela. And Israel has kept him locked up for years and years and years because they know the polling showed he's actually quite a unifying figure in Palestinian society.
I think that Israel has a lot of blame here, and I don't know if my guess, honestly, is that Marwan Barghouti is not a Palestinian Mandela. Okay, maybe he is. I don't know. And if he is, then it's Israel's fault. But be that as it may, there has been no clear message from the Palestinian people that they want to resolve this peacefully. There have been moments, let me finish. There have been moments where they have. There are leaders who've suggested it, but I can tell you that message has not been consistently received by the Israeli people. And I, who am as left as you're going to find right now, or pretty close to it, haven't fully received it. I'm not fully convinced.
Yeah, but I guess that point about dynamic, because what we're doing here...
Let me finish. I'm not fully convinced that they want to resolve things peacefully. I think Israel can take steps to make that more likely that they'll want to. Well, so I don't think they're completely like that. But on the left fringe, they need to do more to convince Israelis than they are. A lot more.
I get you're definitely an exception at the moment, and obviously this isn't about hostility at all. I'm just trying to work out the journey and to see where other people in Israeli society.
It would help if you listen to me a little, because
I am listening.
Remember, the Palestinians have a lot more agency than you're giving them. We have even more agency because we're more powerful. And I say that all the time, but they have a lot of agency, and that's missing from everyone else.
Let me just I suppose what I'd find frustrating there is a both sidesism going on there. Israel. And let me just, but I don't agree with it. I mean, Israel is an occupying power. It's responsible for the longest belligerent, occupying power, longest belligerent occupation in modern history in the West Bank. It is armed to the teeth by the United States, the world's only superpower. The Palestinian people are, in many ways, a collection, partly refugee camps. It's extremely poor, oppressed and occupied people. They don't have an advanced military. And the point, just when you say, well, why aren't they, where's the interest in peace? From the Palestinian perspective, and just to quickly see what you would say to this, and this is why, I'm confused about saying it's not a settler colonial mentality. When the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, the population of Palestine who were Jewish was less than 10%. And that was then promised to the Zionist movement of the time. And obviously, from the Palestinian perspective, that was a case of, our land is being handed to somebody else, and it's been promised by the British Empire to somebody else. And then, with what happened after in 1947, and people go, well, the UN offered this. Well, the UN, offered much more land to the Jewish population compared to their actual percentage of population. So they handed most land, even though they were still a minority. Obviously, the Palestinian people didn't accept that. And I don't really think anybody would have accepted that in that situation. And then they were ethnically cleansed, 750,000 driven from their homes, 15,000 killed. And then in 1967, Gaza and the West Bank were obviously occupied. And then, 1 million Palestinians were arrested. After 1967, we got incarceration. We got then colonization, their land being taken away and used for settlements, which anyone would see as an existential threat. I mean, the point I make, and then, huge, thousands of Palestinians killed. You kind of look at that, you just kind of think, well, we were the majority, not like a century ago. And now we're being handed offered very small parts of what was our land. And we're being brutally oppressed by a state which is armed to the teeth by the world's only superpower. So from that perspective, why would the Palestinian people be interested in peace? Because they think, from their perspective, peace just means their land being colonized and then being occupied and being offered very little compared to what they could have had.
So I'm used to being arguing with right-wing Zionists and so on, and then they give me the history lesson by ignoring all the points you made and stressing a bunch of points that you didn't make. All of their points are true, and all of your points are, not all of their points and not all of your points, but most of the points that you both make are true. And then what happens is you leave out everything else, right? So then you're forcing me into making the Zionist points, right? So I'll just go back. The Balfour Declaration wasn't for a Jewish state; it was for a Jewish home, right? It said we don't deny the rights of Palestinians. They didn't call them Palestinians, but Arabs living there. What happened after that was a series of violent uprisings to try to reverse the idea of having a Jewish home, which led, 1921, 1929, 1936 to 39, lots of Jewish casualties. In the 20s, the Jews didn't even have a militia to defend themselves, never mind an army. They started building that in the 1930s. And you had the attempt to divide Palestine in 36, where most of the territory would have gone to the Arabs, which the Zionists stress and people on your side ignore, right? And in 47, you had the war that was started by the Arabs, and Israel was invaded by all the neighbors. And in 67, Israel told King Hussein, who was occupying the West Bank, we don't want the West Bank, just leave us alone. And he bombed Israel, so Israel went in. You have all these issues that you're ignoring, which is exactly the point. The reason, let me finish. The reason that Israelis don't trust the Palestinians is because from day one of the Zionist movement, they've been trying to destroy the Zionist movement. There's a response here. They lost. They took on a movement they thought was weaker than they were, and they lost. And that's a historical fact. Now, after that happened and Israel became stronger, it exploited its strength to treat Palestinians terribly. But that doesn't mean that you get to go back in time and reverse the fact that their movement was stronger and they gambled, which was a good gamble from their perspective, on destroying the Zionist movement, which was very weak. The Zionist movement cleverly used diplomacy, state building, and military power to defeat the Palestinian nationalist movement. And it was a fair fight, and it won. Yeah. And if the Palestinians had won that fair fight, there would be no Jews in Palestine.
Okay,
let me finish.
It's a long answer.
Okay. Yeah, you invited me.
I know, but it's important because
let me finish. So you have a battle between two national movements, and one of them won. Neither one is born in sin. Neither one is evil. What you have is a competition between two movements. And ultimately, both sides are here to stay, and both sides need to learn to live with each other. There's nothing to be gained, and this is your problem, Owen. There's nothing to be gained by demonizing one of the sides. Right now, Israel's committing a genocide, and that's evil. But
there we go.
Just two more sentences. It doesn't mean that Israel's evil. Just like when Palestinians were committing October 7th and other terrible things to Jews, that doesn't mean that they were evil. This is a competition between two movements, and it needs to be settled. It's not it's not God versus Satan. There's no good and bad here.
Just in terms of what happened early on, you mentioned the Balfour Declaration said that it wouldn't be the foundation of a Jewish home to the disadvantage of those already living there. But the problem is Zionist leaders at the time were not saying that. They were making very, very clear they did not see Palestinians as equal human beings. They specifically referenced and compared what they planned to do with European colonialism. And Theodore Herzl, the way he spoke about the Palestinian people, was gratuitously racist. So what actually happened is they were prophetic about what they thought would actually happen. And you say a fair fight.
None of that's true.
The Israeli
your knowledge of Zionist history is partial. Okay, so Herzl was a man who lived in the late 19th century, so he was no progressive, woke person. But he said, if you read Alte Neuland, that Arabs will do very well in the Jewish state, right? By the standards of the time, he was super enlightened. Read the book. And then the Zionist movement didn't announce that it's pursuing a state. It did in various ways. Announced that it's pursuing a state until the Biltmore Declaration of 42. Until then, they were willing to compromise on whether it's going to be a state or a home in different ways. The Zionist movement during the early 20th century were not saints. I am not saying that. I can find a lot of terrible examples of things that they did.
Yeah, I mean, but obviously you got
the Palestinian movement was not no saint either. In fact, they were much worse early on, and that's a fact. So
just on that, the Zionist movement did make clear that they wanted a state for Jewish people, which was to the exclusion of the Palestinian people. But nonetheless, when we talk about a fair fight, in 1947, 1948, when Zionist militia were launching vicious terrorist attacks, it must be noted, as well as slaughtering Palestinians. I mean, that's not a fair fight, is it? They expelled 750,000 people.
Well, the war started in November 1947 when Palestinian militias put a siege on Jerusalem, including slaughtering convoys, including convoys of nurses and doctors, and the attack to a Tochnit Daled, Nachshon operation, all that stuff, where the Jewish militias ended up, committing what turned into ethnic cleansing.
Yeah,
started as a military operation to clear the roads. You had the roads going from Jerusalem to the ports. They went into the villages that were over the roads that were being used to slaughter the convoys and emptied them of people. And this is what I mean. There's no saints here. There's a war.
Yeah, I guess, again, I mean...
the entire context, and this is a real problem. If you want there to be peace, you have to understand the context. You have to understand the genuine concerns, security concerns of the Jewish people. Because the way they're acting right now, the way they're lashing out right now in Gaza, isn't because they're evil. It's because they feel incredibly insecure because of the Holocaust, because of October 7th.
I get, in the same way.
You would be doing the same thing if you were Israeli, and I would be doing the same thing in Gaza if I was Palestinian. This is a question of circumstances, and
no one disputes that, by the way. And again, the British Empire.
No, when you say settler colonial mindset, you're giving a original sin mindset to all Israelis, by definition, which is not helpful.
You talked about ethnic cleansing. In Israel itself, the pre-1967 Israel, the one founded in 1948, obviously hundreds of Palestinian villages were destroyed and they were settled on by Israeli settlers. And obviously then you got the expansion of those settlements to all over the West Bank, where there were over 700,000 illegal Israeli settlers. That idea of settling and colonizing land is obviously what Zionism is all about. And that's the issue, because you then see yourself you see the land as, if you're a settler colonial movement, as somehow you are the deserving people. And this is obviously wrapped up often in biblical and religious terminology. And therefore the people who are living on the land already, the Palestinian people, are problems. And you work backwards from that, which is why even moderate in Israel today, moderate so-called leaders will talk about the existence of the Palestinians as a problem. That's the issue.
I think what you're mixing up here is basic human instinct for conquest with settler colonialism. I think settler colonialism is a frame. I've written about settler colonialism. I have a peer-reviewed article about settler colonialism. I think it's a useful prism for many things, but you're using it in a way that I don't think is useful. Why? Because throughout history, every single people who had military power used that to take over land, settle, and push other people off. Your people did that all over the world.
Yeah, and it was criminal.
Of course. No, I'm not justifying. I'm just telling you. Yeah. The Arabs did that coming out of Arabia, in the 7th century. We did that in Israel, in the West Bank. That's just what,
I guess the problem
they have military power. They see someone else who has the land they want. They go in, they take it, they settle. It's now illegal. It shouldn't be done. That's what human beings do.
Well, you say that because it is.
Let me finish. Just because your grandfather did that doesn't mean that you're part of some kind of, primal evil culture that can't be fixed. Everyone's grandparents did that. Everyone's grandparents who had power, who weren't victims, did that because that's what people do. And we need to stop people from doing that. But we don't need to label people as evil forever because they're
evil. I think you're inserting moralistic terms here. I'm looking at what I think are clinical descriptions of a political phenomenon, which is different. And that just to point quickly, because I've heard
the diagnosis as much as in the fact that behavior can change.
No, I don't disagree with that, but I think that means dismantling the state as it is in order to create a new state where everyone has equal rights, which is why I advocate. That's it. I just want people to be equal citizens. And I want that to mean Jewish citizens of Israel as they are now having equal rights. That's what I support. But just the point that you made about settler, I suppose, because I hear this argument a lot, which is, well, yeah, Israel did that in, 1948 onwards. And it is an ongoing process. That's the point. It's not just people's grandfathers. It's people now. People who are a lot younger than me are settlers in Israel, not people's grandparents. People who are 20-year-olds people are settling in the West Bank.
And it needs to stop.
But the point is, when people say, well, Israel did that in 1948 and, onwards, but so what did Britain do? You're right. But then that would be like a state being founded in 1948, which practiced slavery, and then going, well, the Americans practiced slavery, didn't they? It's like, yeah, in a different era. and it was defeated because it was a grave evil. And I think that's the problem, that we're talking here about something which actually was, in terms of settler colonialism, overwhelmingly has been stopped and fought against. And in fact, almost with the one exception being Israel, European settler colonialism was brought to an end on the basis it was understood to be a grave injustice. But this is the one exception. It's
not the one exception. You look at China and Tibet and with the Uyghurs, and you can look at the Western Sahara, and you can look at Cyprus. It's not the one exception. It's terrible. It's illegal. It needs to stop. It's not the one exception. It's human nature. It's human nature. And that's why what we need to do is have incentives to stop it.
Okay. Well, finally, that's
where we disagree. I mean,
Well, this is what's interesting to me, because it's about, because I'm really interested in. I mean, that's what I find this fascinating. By the way, I think you've been really, really fascinating, and I find engaging this really educational, just in terms of having that discussion. But just finally, then, I mean, what then next? Because I suppose as things stand, Gaza has been leveled. There is a plan to remove its surviving population. That's an innately genocidal act. But the West Bank is being asphyxiated of its Palestinian population. Life has been made more and more unlivable. And you kind of just think this ends with a greater Israel, in which the entire Palestinian people is removed entirely from what was historic Palestine. I mean, how do we stop that?
Yeah, I think we probably agree on how to stop that at this point. I'm going to say things I would never have said a couple of months ago. I think Israel needs to be sanctioned. I think they need to stop selling arms to Israel. I think they need to put trade embargoes on Israel. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and many other people need to go before the ICC. I think Israel needs to be punished for what it did. I think people need to be held accountable. I think Israel needs to be reformed from the ground up. It needs to have a judicial system that will actually charge the people who did this, because they can't all go to international tribunals. There need to be reforms in the military. And I think the only way to do that, unfortunately, is to sanction Israel and make it pay a very heavy price for what it did, so that the average median Israeli understands that this was a disaster and doesn't support it. I said you're never going to get Israel to dismantle itself. But what you can get is for Israel to stop doing what it's doing, because I don't believe that it's an inherent element. And I think there's a lot of trickery and lies behind it to make Israel support this. And I think if the consequences of it were more apparent to the Israeli people through sanctions and the military not getting weapons, so that the military tells Netanyahu to stop, because the military is so powerful. And the military, by the way, isn't fully behind this operation. I talk to people very high up, and they tell me, I don't really understand what we're doing. I don't understand why we're doing it. I don't understand our strategy. And why is that important? Because if you tell them, if you stop selling them arms, they'll be saying, what are we doing? We're fighting a war that has no point, and now we're not going to have arms, and we're not going to be able to defend ourselves. So you need to pressure Israel on these points.
And the reason I think what you're saying is, obviously I support that, is wise. And this is a conversation which I found chilling but instructive. When I first moved to London, I'm a northerner. People weren't very friendly, and there's this woman started speaking to me, and she turned out she's a young white South African, and I name drop the fact that my dad shared a Coke bottle with Thabo Mbeki in Brighton in the 1960s, and she just went, "Yeah, apartheid just wasn't working anymore." And I did not like that, I'll be honest. But the point was, many white South Africans ended up being forced to conclude, whether they liked it or not, it had run out of road because of the international pressure against their country. Yeah, which is, I think, exactly how this ends. And you are, by the way, I should say, because I found it interesting just obviously going through this, but you really are, it is commendable, the journey you've gone on. It's really important. It is based on, you clearly see Palestinians as humans, obviously, and you are aware that a grave crime is being committed, and things we don't agree on, fine, but we do agree on what I think is obviously one of the great horrors of our time, because it's genocide. I mean, for me, it's the reason I speak out about it all the time is, obviously I thought it was genocide, obviously a lot earlier than you, but I think my government is helping to facilitate a genocide. And I think they are, exactly. And if my view is, which is why I speak out about this, and I felt I had a responsibility to speak out, is just because if you are a citizen of a country with any position or influence or any platform, you kind of got a responsibility. If you think it's a genocide, you have to speak out, because what's worse than that? And I think that's why what you're saying is really important. And I think it's very important. I think people have found this really fascinating and interesting, actually, and will respect greatly the. Go on.
Let me compliment what you're saying. The most responsibility, you have a responsibility. Everyone watching this has a responsibility. The most responsibility is for Jews and for Israelis. We are culpable for what's happening in Gaza. It's our fault. It's being done in our name. We need to stop supporting it. We need to stop supporting it now. And when I came out and I wrote this tweet saying I think it's genocide, I waited too long to say this, or it took a long time to say this. Honestly, too long to say this. I got a lot of very sharp responses. The responses I got from Israel, the ones I got from diaspora Jews, from people here, mostly would not surprise you. They were very angry, including some people who are livid at me. Some people said, "Are you sure in America?" and so on. But the responses I got from Israelis were much more interesting. A lot of them said, "You're right. I'm not really ready to say it yet, but you're right." A lot of them feel that this has gone too far. They're closer to it than the American Jews are. And
well, that's interesting because obviously in America, so many Jewish, because the Jews have always been overrepresented in movements for justice and emancipation and liberation. It's actually one of the reasons that anti-Semites would often go after Jews, because they would go on about, they'd say they're subversives. And actually, a poll last year showed 38% of American Jews under the age of 44 thought Israel was committing genocide. 30% of Jewish Americans overall thought Israel was committing genocide. And I think, I'm always inspired when I see Jewish Americans, particularly younger Jewish Americans, speaking out.
That's a younger generation thing.
No, it is great because it's a great tradition. It's a Jewish humanist. The left wouldn't exist without Jewish people. I mean, in the way that we understand it. Honestly, it's been really, really fascinating. And you should, I do commend the honesty, and I know it's not easy, obviously, what you've done, and you face a backlash, but you've done obviously the right thing, and so many others I hope will follow in your footsteps. Please like and subscribe, everyone watching. Please leave your comments, your thoughts, share the video. But Shaiel, honestly, it's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Owen. It's been a pleasure.